60-some years ago, International Voluntary Services, or IVS, was established in order to start some grassroots type economic development. It was an organization that had virtually no money at all, and it chartered, or it contracted with the U.S. Foreign Aid Program for funding to put volunteers in several countries of Asia and Africa. The first countries were Algeria, Liberia, and later on Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. And those three Indochina countries were where most of the volunteers served and where I actually went in 1962. I had an opportunity to work in either Cambodia or Vietnam, and it was when the Vietnam War had already started. There weren't a lot of Americans over there, but it was a pretty vigorous war between the north and the south parts of Vietnam. It was all part of the effort to contain communism on the part of the U.S. government. And the government enthusiastically supported winning hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese to try to prevent them all from going into the communist camp. Communism in those days were both from the Soviet Union and from China, and China was the closer and the much more dominant participant in all of that activity in Southeast Asia. So I wound up going to Cambodia rather than Vietnam because I had no real interest in the Cold War, and Cambodia was a socialist country. It had no particular political leanings, and it just seemed to me a more interesting opportunity. It was also an opportunity just out of college for me to see a part of the world that I'd heard about, wanted to go to, and so I went there. Actually, it was not a very well organized business at that time. IVS was still a pretty loose, non-bureaucratic organization. There were no rules to speak of. I remember when they offered me the job, they sent me a 3-page recruitment letter that I would be helping to rehabilitate old irrigation canals built about almost 1,000 years ago in what is now the Angkorian Temple complex of Siem Reap in Cambodia. It was a wonderful opportunity for somebody like myself who had studied irrigation engineering and had an interest in that part of the world. I went over with another volunteer, a guy from South Dakota, also from a farm, like I was from an agricultural background. We both went over as technicians, as volunteers, to assist in agricultural development in Cambodia, in different parts of the country. But as we got closer and closer, the plane stopped first in Tokyo, then it stopped in Hong Kong, then we got off in Saigon, and finally the last stop was in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. And at each stop along the way, it became clearer to me that this idea of rehabilitating irrigation projects was a dream that somebody had to recruit people, but nobody had bothered to consult the government about it, and there was no job there. Rather, both Harlan Gross and I were stationed at an agricultural livestock station in the southeast corner of Cambodia, quite close to Vietnam, with the idea of taking care of cattle on a rather large jungle livestock station that had been, the cattle had been donated by Nehru in India as a state gift to the head of state, Sihanouk, and our job was to help make that station viable, provide for the cattle. My job in particular was to look after equipment, machinery. We had 3 bulldozers. We almost lost one of them in quicksand at one stage. Training people, trying to get people, the local people, to use some of this equipment in a productive way. I also helped build a water system for our place because we had no water. IVS was an organization that was primarily established to promote people-to-people contact. We weren't high profile, we didn't have money to speak of. The idea was to promote the individual contact with people in that part of the world. And to me, the most satisfying part of that period was to just sit around in the evenings and talk with people, their families. There was no furniture in people's homes. They were very poor people with essentially maybe $100 a year of annual income. They had nothing much more than the shirts on their backs, the clothes. Even if there were a flood that wiped away most of their goods, they just start again the next year. We would sit around, usually we had no electricity. There would be a candle burning kerosene in the center of the room, and people would just sit around in the evenings on the outside. And I was accepted, and so was Harlan. And we could participate because we had learned the language. And it was an enjoyable opportunity for me, but it was not really what I came for. Those were people who were paid a small salary to look after this livestock. And after about a year, I was moved, it was at my choice, to a remote corner of the country where Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia all join. And that was a very different experience. There, at least, I was supposed to be working with real farmers, trying to promote rice production and other types of agricultural enterprises. But it was very close to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was a very sensitive area. It was before the American bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but it was still, people were very nervous and sensitive about it, and I found myself just not in a comfortable location. Those are the years when Kennedy, first John Kennedy, and then Robert Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King were all assassinated. And about that time, Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam, was also assassinated. The head of state of Cambodia was convinced that the American government was behind Diem's assassination. And he saw himself as being the next in line. And he didn't want any Americans left in his country, and all of us were told to leave immediately. I had to leave my location where I was. I had to take a boat down the Mekong River. It was about a 13 or 14 hour boat ride down to the capital of Phnom Penh. I had to buy an air ticket out of the country. I was one of the last Americans to actually leave. And I left behind all of my books and clothes, and I had a motorcycle at that stage. I had to leave it all behind at this remote location. And I've often wondered what happened to all of that stuff. And I wound up going back at this stage to IVS's operations in Vietnam. I was much more sympathetic now to why the United States was engaged in the controversy about Vietnam. It had become a war. Winning hearts and minds was a strategy of the U.S. government to try to give the Vietnamese in the South a reason and a hope and some future in a country free of communism. And that was basically what I signed up for in my second chapter with IVS. It was a chapter that involved both agricultural development on the one hand and community development on the other hand. Agricultural development was primarily rice. Rice was the dominant food, and is today, of all of Southeast Asia. And I was posted to the Mekong Delta because, in part, it was comfortable for me. I'm from a part of Long Island where we have salt marshes, and the marsh grass grows out of the salt water and comes up, and of course it's very flat. The Mekong Delta is very much like that, only it's rice that's growing up out of this flat, flooded wetlands. And it's a productive part of the country. It basically feeds not only the southern part, but all of Vietnam. I was comfortable for that reason. And it was also comfortable for me because in the Delta, there are about 1 million ethnic Cambodians living there. I had learned the Cambodian language, and so I went about learning Vietnamese, and I became, people asked me if I was fluent in those languages. I was really very fluent, but with a limited vocabulary. It was limited to what I was doing and the ordinary, finding restaurants and doing this or that. So it was comfortable work for me. Agricultural development was based primarily on rice. And now, at that time, the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines had come up with several new rice varieties that were much more productive than the old ones. Those varieties are what we were promoting. There was also a community development aspect of our work, and it worked like this. The government would make 20,000 piastres, which was only a couple of $100s, available to a village to put in some project that they wanted for that village, provided they would vote ahead of time what they wanted to do, and that they would contribute their own labor to build it. Women tended to want maternity wards and clinics. The men wanted a bridge over a canal or maybe a marketplace area. And I found that my job was to sit with some of the leaders of this program on the government side and hold the meetings, and just my being there tended to give some assurance to people that the meetings would actually be held, that the results of it would be upheld, and that the program could go forward. For my last few months there, I was responsible for placing new volunteers in different parts of the country. Looking back on those days, there are two or three sort of conclusions that I've come to. One of them was that this was, in some sense, an early phase of what we now call globalization. It was an opportunity and an effort on the part of Americans to engage in overseas people, to relate to them, not so much for economic gain, not for trade, but just for understanding. It was a time when air travel was first becoming easy, available. The Boeing 707 and the DC-8 were the first big jet airplanes, and they had just become in service. They had just come into service, and they were they made possible the kind of travel that we kind of took for granted in the years that followed. It was an invigorating opportunity, and it was a way of engaging with people internationally. Many of my colleagues who were with us, volunteers, went on to serve in various capacities most of their productive lives in overseas work. In my own case, I spent 25 years, over a 25-year span of time, engaged primarily in the science of agricultural development. I wasn't much interested in working for a government, and I was definitely not interested in staying on as a volunteer forever. But I was interested in looking for technological development in agriculture that would make farming more profitable and more productive for those countries. The second conclusion that I came to was that the role of government can be really important. There are examples of countries that have come a long ways because they've had a good, solid, relatively uncorrupted government, and have made real steps in productivity of their country in terms of economic gain, in terms of economic potential. Singapore is such an example. When I first visited Singapore in 1962, it was just another poor Asian city. In fact, there were riots and there was all kinds of stuff going on. Singapore today has a standard of living higher than the United States on a per capita basis. It's an unusual example, and of course it's a very small city country. But it shows to me that there are things that you can do if government is strict and clear and disciplined to carry out some of the changes that we need in today's world. There are many other countries that have not managed that, they're still essentially corrupted. There's a lot of self-interest. There's factions fighting one another, and those countries have not made much progress at all. So I see today, in today's world, the place for disciplined, careful government, and it just seems like there aren't all that many places where those kinds of governments are in place.